Hi, everybody, and welcome to this latest election lunch hour from UK and a Changing Europe. You can't see me. That's because I've got problems with my camera on Zoom. No idea why, but we thought we wouldn't hold it up for that because it's frankly not worth waiting for to get me on camera. But luckily, we can see my fantastic panel. Fantastic panel are our very own Paula Surridge, Deputy Director of UK in Changing Europe, and Professor, I think, of Political Sociology at the University of Bristol. Paula's nodding, that's good. Sophie Stowers. Sophie is a researcher here at UK and Changing Europe, has been writing some superb guides to elections and polling, and also was one of the big movers behind the Seats to Watch publication we put out last week, which is what we're going to be discussing today. And last but by no means least, I'm joined by Luke Tryl, who's the UK Director of More in Common. Now, you've been on this before, you know the form, sending your questions on Slido. Please upvote the questions you like, even though that question's not quite as good as the way you'd have asked it, but it's very helpful because then it allows me to pick things off at the top. But I'm going to get going now. Sophie, could you start by telling us how you went about analysing which seats to watch, and how did you cope with the fact that there are boundary changes in quite a lot of places? So how did you go about this analysis that we put out last week?
I think sometimes when we think about seats to watch, quite often immediately you think about marginal seats or seats where like a big name from either party looks like they're going to lose or it's going to swap hands. And that is obviously, they are interesting seats, but actually we thought there's actually more to look at, and that a lot of the kinds of changes, not just in who wins a seat, but in vote share and who gains, who loses votes and things like that, they actually tell us stuff that's going to be interesting past polling day about changes in electrogeography in this country, different strategies that parties are taking and where they're kind of making new voters are concentrated, what are the new marginals in this country and all that kind of thing. So we were actually interested in looking at kind of a broader array of different kinds of categories of seats. So on the UK and Changing Europe website, you can see from our homepage that I think we've got 10 categories of seats. And then within each of those 10 categories, we've chosen up to about 5 who kind of belongs to that category, who might be interesting to look at. So you've got, kind of typical bellwether seats, seats that might be more marginal. So all that kind of traditional seats to watch style kinds of constituency. But then we've also got the seats which have, say, the highest concentration of graduates, the most diverse seats where Labour might never have won but look like they could this time, seats where smaller parties like the Liberal Democrats look like they could make gains or wins, and also things like seats that in any other election the Conservatives should keep hold of and shouldn't be a concern for them, that look like they might change hands this time around. So it actually tells us more than just kind of what seats are marginal and what seats might flip, but actually about kind of the trends that are underlying that. And you can find those on our website as well. Quick plug.
Very good quick plug, Sophie. So Paula, you've done lots of sort of analysis of voting behaviour over quite a few years, so I'm really interested in what you think are the really interesting categories that we have here. I'm not sure you're allowed to say all of them, though you can of course say all of them, but what are you watching these out for, and where will you be particularly interested in focusing a bit of attention?
So, as Sophie said, we've got the kind of usual seats here, the traditional swing seats, and we've got the kind of what's come to be called the blue wall seats. But given the current polling, to some extent, those seats aren't that interesting because we expect Labour to win all the swing seats and we expect the Lib Dems to win most of the blue wall seats. So they're not really the seats that are going to tell us the most about how well or badly parties are doing. So I have tried to answer your question properly and not just say all of them. So I've pulled out 3 that I think we should watch most closely. The first is the SNP Labour battlegrounds, partly because I think we know the least about those. We have much less Scottish polling than we have for the whole of Great Britain. The census data hasn't come, so the MRPs find predicting Scotland that bit more difficult. And there are a whole bunch of seats there where the SNP and Labour are in competition, and they're quite close, too close to call. So that's the first group. Then two more groups. One is the what we've called Labour breakthrough, which are places that Labour could win, but we wouldn't probably have expected them to, maybe even at the start of the campaign. And we wouldn't have pointed to them as sort of seats that were winnable or swingable. And then there's this group of seats, which I've been talking about quite a lot over the last week, where the Conservative majorities are huge. They voted really strongly in favour of leaving the European Union. But when you start to dig into the MRPs and look at them, you just can't call them safe seats anymore. Places where majorities were 50 or 60%. And those seats will be really helpful on the night for giving us because some of those come through quite early, a really early indication of how successful Reform UK have been in eating into that Conservative vote. So those are the three kind of categories I'd be watching the closest.
That's really interesting. I'm going to pass that on to Luke now. Luke, you'll have seen our Seats to Watch publication. Other categories you'd have added if you'd been doing it? And I'm really interested in your views on Paula's views of what those interesting categories are, whether you're looking out for those, and in particular, how we should be reading Labour SNP, those seats that Labour might be appearing in. I mean, what's driving that? And in particular, really, really interesting whether all those Conservative peril seats are just because of reform, and what are they telling us there? Are there special factors going on? We were just looking today at one of those seats, which I think is Liz Truss's seat in Norfolk South West, where she's facing a challenge from a disgruntled former Conservative. I'm not sure whether he's former Conservative chairman. So are they ones where particular things are going on?
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for having me. It's delighted to join you. And I think this is a really excellent and really helpful tool, which we'll certainly be using on election night. And I think in particular, there is a tendency, I think, with lots of these types of analysis, just to sort of go through this is the seat which gets Labour 50 gains, this is the one that gets to 100. When we know in this election, there are lots of individual and quite different races going on. And that's one of the things which has really jumped out through the focus groups that we've done. We can be in Boston and Skegness, and it's a totally different race to what was happening in Maidenhead, what was happening in Spelthorne, what was happening in Edinburgh North. Despite the overall narrative, there are lots of different contests. And I really like the way that these categories basically allow you to kind of group them together. So I certainly wouldn't disagree with the categorization. One of the things which really jumped out at me, and I think, spells out the difficulty that the Conservatives find themselves in, is how many of the seats, when I was looking at it, are in Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire. And I think it really speaks to that heartland problem the Tories are having at the moment, that these traditionally quite safe seats, in Oxfordshire, obviously, you've got David Cameron's former seat of Witney, which I think is not one of the seats, but almost everywhere else in Oxfordshire is one of them. You've got the Liberal Democrats primarily, but also in places like Banbury eating into them too. And I'm really interested in that, because whether or not those seats all fall, I think will say a lot about the future shape of the Conservative Party as well, because it does tend to be quite a different profile of Conservative voters somewhere like Oxfordshire to some of the other seats. I also really like the quite heavily voting Leave seat category that you've put up. It actually matches quite closely with the Whitby woman seats that we identified at the start of the campaign. This is people who are normally reliable Tory voters, voted Leave, tend to be women approaching retirement age. They are over-indexed in these East Coast coastal seats, and you see some of them there: Louth and Horncastle, Boston, Skegness, goes right down to Clacton. I was sad Scarborough and Whitby itself wasn't in it, but I won't hold that against you. Again, I'm really interested in what happens there, because I think in those seats, you have the reform challenge, but you also have reform potentially letting Labour in as well. So very interesting there. And then, of course, the Scottish seats. And I think the big thing, we know that Labour are going to make gains in Scotland. And I think some of those seats, Mid Lothian, East Lothian, I think we can be fairly certain are going to fall. But what's interesting, and I find this every time we run our MRP model, is so many Scottish seats are on a knife edge that sort of tiny fractions here and there can make all the difference. So whilst I have a prior that I think Labour are going to come out of these elections as the largest party in Scotland, I think they're still really interesting seats, because actually they could just tilt the other way and Labour ends up closer to 20 seats than they do to some of those higher projections as well. So I think it's a really interesting, useful tool. On the reform factor, and to what extent is that driving things? Well, I think it's certainly damaged the Conservatives' prospects of achieving narrowing in lots of these seats. And the fact that, as others have discussed, the fact that reform didn't stand in any Conservative seats last time obviously means they're having an outsized impact in these seats. But it is also true that, the Conservatives wouldn't be in the mess that they were in if they hadn't lost quite so many votes to Labour. They weren't losing votes to the Liberal Democrats in the south of England. And I think there's a sort of question for what comes afterwards, in which I imagine lots of the analysis of this election for the Conservatives is going to be about losses to reform, which might be a slight mistake given, if they hadn't lost so many votes the other way, they would have had a much less bad result. So, and then the final thing that I would say is, it was interesting. I thought that you grouped them. Basically, I think they fall under the category of the educated, graduate heavy seats in here. One of the things which I'm really interested in this election is to what extent do the Greens and potentially some other independents set themselves up as a repository for left-wing discontent under a Labour government. We don't think they're going to make major gains this time, but I think in the next version of seats to watch in 2028, 2029, I think there are going to be a lot more of those seats where we say, are the Greens now the Liberal Democrats of the 2000s for disgruntled Labour voters? So that's my kind of potted overview, but I think it's fantastic and lots of fun playing with it.
Thanks very much, Luke. That's really, really good. Immediate question. This is a question, Sophie, that Anand was asking this morning. It's Anand Menon, who runs UK and Changing Europe. So we might as well answer his question, which is, why do the Greens appear to be potentially doing well in Bristol, graduate heavy seat, but why is there no sort of green breakthrough predicted in London in some of the graduate heavy Labour seats here? And I think, building on that, where are the sort of seats that might be really interesting to see whether what we might call the sort of Gaza-Palestine issue is really leading Labour into some problems? Sophie, do you want to have a first pitch at that? Or
my honest answer is that I'm not 100% sure, but if I had to guess, I think part of it would be the diversity that you get in London that you don't get in a seat like Bristol Central. And I don't think we typically see the ethnic minority vote being as strong for the Greens as it is for the Labour Party usually. I think we've seen hints of that maybe shifting in particular seats like you mentioned, Jill. So in certain places, like Bradford, some of the Birmingham seats, the Green Party does seem to be gaining some voters, some ethnic minority voters, particularly Muslim voters who are dissatisfied with Labour's position on Gaza. But otherwise, there doesn't, I think, seem to be as strong of a shift in that way amongst diverse voters, which obviously the London seats tend to have a higher concentration of non-white voters. And I think maybe that sort of affluence in the class kind of answers some of that as well. If you look at, say, the deprivation score, the IMD score for Bristol Central, it's a lot higher, and that is a lot more affluent of a place than a lot of the London seats as well. And I think that maybe has something to do to it, but that would kind of be my guess, as a combination of those two factors, with probably the caveat as well that the Greens have typically had a better performance, I think, at local level in Bristol for a longer periods of time than they have in London too. So I think there's more of kind of a perception of the Greens, I think, being kind of a winnable party in Bristol than there is in London, just because they have control of the council there now, I think, and they've won the council seats there for quite a long time. So I think there's just perception that it's not necessarily a wasted vote voting for them in Bristol in the same way that it might be in one of the London seats. If I had to take a stab at it, that's probably what I would say.
All sounds pretty good to me, Sophie, but sort of what do I know? One of the things that those of us who sort of grew up watching swingometers were very used to was the idea of national swings. But clearly this year we've seen a sort of combination of two things, you might say. MRP polling taking the sort of polling down from, if there's a 15% swing this way, this goes into sort of more forecasting seats at individual level, but also much more efficient voting strategies by some of the smaller parties, with the potential Lib Dem reversal from getting loads of votes and no seats to getting not that many votes, but potentially lots of seats, with a targeting strategy, maybe informed by the fact that they're now being targeted.
Not sure if we've lost Jill or if she's still there.
No.
We lost half of that question, Jill. I don't know what happened, so we don't know what to answer.
Sophie, I'm back.
Oh, good. I panicked for a minute then, Jill. You have to ask your question again.
But I can't see any of you. So I was just saying, we've seen a sort of...
No, we've lost her. Let's just between us have a go at uniform and proportional swing, because I think that's what Jill's getting at.
I am back. I was going to ask the extent to which the sort of the ability to forecast seats at individual level was feeding into party strategies now and was enabling them to do targeted strategies more effectively, and whether voters had sort of wised up to how to vote tactically, because you might want to vote tactically. We need to know certain things, particularly with boundary changes, about how to do that. Paula, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, I'm not sure which of the many questions you started to ask in that section to have a go at. So, I mean, let's talk about voters, and if voters have got the information rather than parties, because parties, of course, collect their own information. They're not reliant entirely on the string of MRPs that come out for the public. They've got their own targeting data that they're using. Have voters got the information to vote tactically? Well, there's plenty of information out there for them. It doesn't all tell them the same thing. And what we actually tend to find when people are asked, and I think it was Luke that was showing some data on this earlier today about what people expected to happen, we find that people are not very good at saying what they think will happen, that actually they're quite often wrong. There was some data floating around a couple of days ago that showed, people not really necessarily expecting a Labour majority, people saying they hadn't seen much in the polls. John Mellon's work from previous elections show that even people who want to vote tactically quite often have the second place party in their constituency wrong. But having said all that, what we have seen at local elections over the last couple of years is that voters seem to have been able to work out who's best to vote for, where they're trying to get rid of a Conservative incumbent. Now, I don't know what information they're using for that, and I don't know if it's easier to do that at kind of ward local level than it would be at a general election. But if that were to play out, it could be potentially really devastating, because we have seen that work, working really, I want to say well, but that's not quite what I mean, working really effectively at local level and against the Conservatives. And the Greens benefit from that as well. I think that was an important thing to add to that discussion about the Greens. We all talk about them as a challenge to Labour, but there's lots of places where they're picking up Conservative voters as well. And the Greens themselves will face some challenges as a result of that, because they'll have a slightly odd coalition of voters as well. Sorry, I tried to answer a whole range of questions because I wasn't sure which one you'd asked.
That was brilliant, and apologies to everybody for the fact that King's internet is a bit of a nightmare. Luke, do you agree with that? I mean, how good is constituency level forecasting. We've seen these sort of MRPs and people getting very excited, MPs getting very excited, maybe the job application in the post if they are forecast to lose their seat. But should we trust those? And are the different MRPs basically coming out with the same story or with rather different stories about individual seats?
Well, I rather hope we can trust them because they're quite a lot of work to build, and if we can't, then they're not. No, I do think it's interesting. I think, you know, if you look at the range of MRPs, it is quite big. And again, if I look at the Conservative seat share, because that seems to be where there's particular variance. You know, you've got Conservatives dropping as low as I think around 60 on some. Our last MRP had the Conservatives up on 155, although that is now somewhat out of date. Final model tomorrow. So that is quite a big range. But I think it also speaks to the fact that if you look at any of the MRPs, there are a lot of seats which are projected to be very close, right? And I think what the MRPs tell us collectively is that we shouldn't be surprised if there is a range anywhere from, again, Conservative seats, anywhere from around 160 to 60. Seems to me to be what the MRPs are telling us. Now, I think perhaps part of the challenge, so that's what I think they're most useful for. I think part of the challenge is because they do have individual seat projections, is people now might be ascribing slightly more to them than what I think they should be doing. You know, there are lots, having more data obviously helps, but, you know, specific local factors are quite difficult to pick up on an MRP because, you know, they're designed to be models of how different types of voters would vote across the country and then applied to particular constituencies. So I think probably after this campaign, there'll be a moment for us to sort of reflect and look at what MRPs do well, what they don't do well as well. So I think that's part of it. But I think it's interesting. I mean, they have certainly been adopted by at least one tactical voting website. I saw that ours, not of our initiative, entirely of the Daily Mail's initiative, they decided to use ours for their pro-conservative tactical voting. So people clearly are using them. And I think there is no doubt some voters are voting tactically. In fact, it was a group in Maidenhead that I did this weekend where it was the first time I heard the phrase tactical voting in the wild this election campaign. And you sort of expect it's those seats where you tend to get voters who are slightly more engaged, where the Liberal Democrats have established themselves as quite a clear challenger, where I suspect we'll see tactical voting at its greatest. And it's why on these kind of, you know, those blue wall, I've now lost it. Was it Blue Wall First Wave or Blue Wall Defence they're called? I think they are really at risk because of that.
Really, really interesting. Thanks, Luke. And now I want to come on with some of the questions that are coming in. And many questioners want to know how late they need to stay up based on our analysis. And of course, they're very close races. Close races might require recounts, so there's no guarantee of declaration times. But who would like to give me a bit of a guide to when I can see first trends emerging and impress my friends at individual seats declare and I suddenly say, oh, that suggests this is happening? Sophie, do you feel at all able to give people like Holly, Maria, Anonymous, or whatever, any guides to how many sort of, you know, cups of coffee they need to be getting through before they can safely go to bed and have understood the potential outcome of the election?
I mean, I can give a little bit, although I do think Paula's been revising the seat times better than me, so I think she'll be on it. But
yeah, I'll get Paula, Paula come in afterwards.
As a first start, I mean, we know that the Northeast tends to count their votes incredibly quickly, particularly around Sunderland and Newcastle. So I think some of those initial maybe red wall seats that under our categories, those ones that are based in the Northeast anyway, they might come in relatively quickly, I think. And by quickly, I mean around sort of midnight-ish. I think that's usually around the earliest that we tend to get any seat. But from looking at the Press Association, I think this week brought out a list of projected seat times, and with the caveat that, constituency seats, particularly if they're close and they do have recounts, as you mentioned, Jill, they do kind of tend to fall behind schedule a little bit. I think about between 3:30 and 5 o'clock is when we'll have the clearest idea of what is going to happen, which I realise is a big time gap, but we're all going to be awake for it, so we can tell you what happens in the morning if you don't want to stay up.
Okay, so presumably from the northeast seats, Paula, I can start to tell, is the red wall really crumbling? Probably expect to see, but if polling is anywhere near right, it'd be quite a confounding effect. When might I start seeing sort of blue wall crumbling, or, reform is really making a difference coming through?
So the Conservative kind of strong leave seats that I was talking about as giving us quite a good indication of how Reform doing, quite a few of those come in relatively early. So 3 of our seats to watch in that category are due before 2 o'clock. So you've got Broxburn, Castlepoint and Redcar coming in quite early. And they will give us quite a good read on how Reform are doing, I think, as well as Labour. Then you've got Cannock Chase as the earliest of the sort of traditional swing seats. I mean, if that doesn't go Labour, then the pollsters will be crying by that point, I suspect. And Hexham, one of our breakthrough seats for Labour, coming around about the same time. So I think by about 2:30, we'll have quite a good idea how good a night it's going to be for Labour. But we won't get those kind of blue wall seats till a bit later. So how bad it is for the Conservatives, whether there's any glint at all of the Lib Dems as the official opposition, we probably won't know that till a bit later, when you're seeing seats like Wimbledon, Taunton, Cheadle. You're talking kind of 3:30 through to 5 for those kind of seats. So we'll have a pretty good idea what's going on for Labour, I think, by about 2:30. But if you really want to know the result, you're just going to have to stay up all night. That's the only way to do it.
And Luke, you were talking about watching those Labour SNP contests, which are obviously very, very interesting. Do they count overnight? Are we going to see some of those? Because for some, the ballot boxes have to be, transported really quite a long way, don't they? When we get some of the sort of Western Isles and things like that, when can we expect to see really interesting things? Because that's largely concentrated. Is it in Scotland's central belt that we're really interested in?
Yeah, so from and I actually don't have it in front of me, but from memory, particularly those central belt seats, and this is my memory going back to 2015 and watching some of those early SNP gains, they actually came in reasonably early from memory. It was sort of, again, in that sort of 2-3 o'clock period before some of the more high profile results that we saw elsewhere. So I think we should, again, on a sort of similar time frame, get those results in Scotland. But again, Paula probably will know better than I do on that.
Paula, do you know?
It's only because I had a heads up and I spent the whole morning collating the times, literally spent the whole morning doing this. And I've made, if you look on my Twitter feed, I've made you a handy ready reckoner that's got all the times for all the seats in our seat to watch. So you can print that one off. But the Scottish seats in our seats to watch, we're looking at about 3:30 in the morning, kind of Glasgow, Coatbridge, Lothian East and places like that. So, I mean, not the earliest indicators, but you're not having to wait up all night if Scotland's what you're mostly interested in.
Okay, not all night, even in Scotland or whatever. Anonymous has asked a very popular question that you may not want to answer. Panel predictions for their Portillo moment, or as I sometimes refer to it, my Ed Balls moment, when you suddenly discover, I was in a cafe for that one, but anyway, when you suddenly discover that some very high profile politician has gone. Does anyone want to say who they think is the sort of most vulnerable cabinet member, for example? And when I think in Labour, the only shadow cabinet member who looks under threat is Thangam Debonair in Bristol. Looks like she's got quite a battle on with the Greens. Any sort of predictions of whatever? Or are we too high-minded and academic to personalise it at that level?
I can take it from our seats to watch, because we've got I can't say this seat name and it's driving me mad. Godalming on Ash. Is that vaguely right?
I call it Godalming, but anyway, yeah.
I have no idea. I just have never heard it out loud. But most of the MRPs have that going to the Liberal Democrats, and of course that's where Jeremy Hunt is seeking re-election. So basing it actually on our seats to watch rather than personalities, that's one certainly to watch. And I can even tell you that's expected to declare about 3:30.
And is that one where we'll be able to see, is that sort of early evidence? This is another question from Peter Ruddock, of whether that's an early evidence of successful tactical voting if Jeremy Hunt goes.
My only question, I mean, it will, if he goes, it will be, I think, a result of tactical voting. My only question is, there are such unique circumstances in that seat by virtue of the fact that he is high profile. It's also interesting when you talk to anyone about the campaign he's running, and apparently he's running a very energetic campaign there. I would be more inclined to look at somewhere just slightly, I think it's slightly north, but I'm probably getting it wrong, in Esher and Walton, somewhere like that, which is a very marginal seat. It's right at the top of the Lib Dem target list. If they don't win that, they're having a very bad night, and you'll be able to, I think, tell from the squeeze on the Labour vote there what's happening. And
that was the seat that Dominic Raab was the MP for, but is not contesting at this election. So there isn't a Dominic Raab moment, even though it is his old seat, but it's been quite long predicted as a big Liberal Democrat target seat, hasn't it? Sophie, do you want to come in on this, or are you going to take the fifth?
I'll have a go, but I will also try and link it to our seats to watch, maybe. In that Liz Truss's seat, which I think is it Northwest Norfolk? I can never remember like whether it's got a west on the end or yeah. So that's it anyway. I think that's in our seats to watch, but it's actually one of those which we think, like, if the Conservatives lose that or look like they're going to lose that, then they're having an incredibly difficult night, and probably they're looking at a seat count towards kind of the worst projections. I think if they're losing seats like that, that's actually one of the more interesting ones though that we pick out of that category, because it's actually one of the only seats where the Lib Dems have actually had any kind of local level success in the last few years in terms of, gaining council seats and things like that. So all of those seats, if we had to predict one to go, we might be leaning towards that one. But I think actually what's interesting is that a lot of the seats that really do look like they might go are not necessarily people who are in the cabinet at the moment, but who have been kind of like names of the Tory party really for decades. There's Tory MPs who have served in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet who look like they might lose their seat this time around. For the fact that a seat like Sir Peter Bottomley's seat, for example, which I think is Witham West, I've been looking at constituent names that long that they've all sort of blended into one, and they're all really long as well now, so I can't remember all parts of them. But that seat's been Conservative since the Second World War. They've never got less than 20% majority there. The fact that could feasibly go Labour this election, the father of the house could lose his seat, I think that speaks volumes about how bad the night for the Conservatives could be. So he might not be, a household name or a cabinet member, but I think if he goes, then it's kind of a symbol of how far the Conservative Party is shifting, I think.
That's really interesting. So Sophie brings me on to a sort of another question from Anonymous. If polls are correct and there are lots of Conservative losses, which is clearly potential if we have the sort of numbers coming out, will the Conservative MPs remaining be from the right or from the centre of the party? I don't know whether any of you have looked at who's still standing potentially and what a difference it makes if there are sort of, the top end, 160. I think Craig Oliver was on Newsnight saying 170 the Conservatives would feel on current polling numbers they've done quite well, or the under 100. Does that make a difference to the composition? Because all that matters both for who's in to contest a future leadership, but also who emerges from the stage with the MPs. Luke, do you have any feel for what different numbers might mean for the balance in the Conservative Party inside a new parliament?
So it looks like, based on some analysis that we did, that if you kind of do raw numbers and raw swing, it tends not to make that much difference to the ideological composition. So what you lose automatically is the kind of red wall seat. So that more kind of yeah, I guess what you might call more, it's not quite right, but sort of authoritarian left bent in the Conservative Party falls out quite quickly. And we expect those seats to go. So that is definitely not there. But then in terms of the split between what you might call the more Cameronite wing of the Conservative Party and the more kind of traditional right, I think that remains relatively evenly. But then what matters, and this again is why the seats to watch is so interesting, is if there is a disproportionate swing in some of those areas, then that does start to affect the composition. So it generally tends to be the case. It's a slight generalization, but in those sort of Lib Dem adjacent seats, they tend to be more on the One Nation wing of the party. And in some of those seats, you know, in sort of Essex, Norfolk, Suffolk, which are traditional Tory heartlands, they tend to be more the other way. So if it is in those Leave voting seats, the Tory vote, big Leave voting seats, the Tory vote collapses, then you could end up with more One Nationers left. Equally, if the Lib Dems make big gains into the blue wall, you could end up with a more right-leaning party.
That brings us on to a very interesting question, Paula, about reform. Because obviously in those Leave voting seats is where we might, other things being equal, expect reform to be doing relatively well. Do we think reform will get significant numbers of votes? We might add, you know, where might they get the most significant numbers of votes and in which seats? And then I'm going to come on to a question, warn you all about high profile independent candidates, or indeed the highest profile candidate possibly of them all in form of Nigel Farage. Paula, yeah, where do we expect to see reform doing well, and will that cost the Conservatives in those Leave voting areas?
Part of reform's problem is that actually they don't have places where they do really, really well. Because if they did, they'd be looking like the Lib Dems and being able to take far more seats. So actually, I would expect to see a significant reform share across a whole range of seats. Where it's most hidden and most difficult to predict is, of course, in the seats where they didn't stand in 2019. So there's a lot of, I haven't quite worked out why. I know somebody on Twitter suggested it was something to do with Danelaw, but it tends to be on the east of the country, well, predominantly. That's a question for the historians. And it tends to be in those strong Leave-leaning seats, obviously, because they're drawing, you know, almost 100% of their vote comes from those that voted Leave in 2016. So they tend to be a little bit more concentrated in those seats, but their real problem is that they don't have heartlands in the way that the Lib Dems have managed to develop for this election. In terms of the number of votes, I'll go with vote share because I'm not very good with numbers. I'm not very good with raw numbers like percentages. I think reform will outperform UKIP's 2015 share. So that puts them 13, 14%, possibly higher, because I do think we've got a lot of hidden reform support that we're not necessarily able to model very well. Having said that, it's just really difficult because most of the pollsters haven't given us a new poll this week, which is very naughty, having given us about 6 a week up to this point. Most of them are kind of keeping their powder dry for tomorrow. And there is a slight sense, I think, of some of the wind having gone out of reform sales. So before I might have said 18%, now 14 to 16 looks a bit more likely. I'm also prepared to be horribly wrong because I am regularly.
I'm quite interested in there being a sort of whole slew of polls tomorrow. Luke, I'm going to come on to independence, but I just want to ask you one very quick question. Quite a lot of people will already have voted because they've voted by post and will have been voting for the last week or so if their postal votes actually arrived. When you're doing polling, how do you take that into account? Because obviously those people are clearly certain voters, where for the rest of us, we might just not get round to it, go to a party instead or whatever. Just decide there's something more interesting on television. So how do you take into account in your polling? Do you actually differentiate and ask people, have you actually already voted or not?
Well, this is an area where you have to be slightly careful and can end up accidentally breaking the Representation of the People Act if you're not careful. No, I can tell you what I can do. So we have them included along with people who are 10 out of 10 to vote, and that's how we do it. If you were to break it out, that would be a breach of law. So it's one of those list of things that you don't quite realize until you get into positions of responsibility in polling, where you might accidentally be responsible for something like that. But that's how we do it.
Oh, right. Okay. Interesting. So independence, and we've got questions about, Jeremy Corbyn. What are his chances? What were the implications of a near miss? I think Nigel Farage does sort of do celebrity of George Galloway fighting Rochdale. Never, I think, won at a general election a seat that he's won at a by-election. Do those sorts of big name recognition candidates, does it make a big difference they end up with big personal ones? Are you expecting Corbyn to win in his seat? I've got a former Labour MP standing to split the Labour vote in my constituency, she said. So quite interesting to see. Seat that MRP is predicting, I think, to go Labour. So are those sort of splitting Corbynistas going to have an impact? Not obviously on the final outcome. Luke.
So I think they will. I mean, I think some of them are going to do quite well. I think Corbyn is certainly going to take a significant number of votes, whether he wins or not. There was a constituency poll which implied he wouldn't. It was interesting. We did a focus group in Islington North, and half the group basically seemed unaware he was running, which is interesting. Again, given how engaged we all are. Well, of course, that's the big battleground. They didn't know, and in fact were far more cross about the treatment of Diane Abbott than Jeremy Corbyn. But, the Pfizer in Chingford is a really interesting example of where there is possibility. I think if this were a closer election, she might well have let Ian Duncan Smith survive. I still think the swing is so hard and the majority so narrow, it's unlikely. Some of the other interesting ones, in particular, are Shabana Mahmood's seat, which is Birmingham Ladywood, off the top of my head, if I'm not getting that wrong. That's interesting because, of course, Yaqub, who was the candidate who ran in the West Midlands mayoral election, actually did very well. And all of the pollsters struggled to pick that up in the run-up to that election. So I'd be looking at some of those Birmingham seats there. Also in Leicester, you've got Keith Vaz running again. So MRP models basically can't pick, that stuff up unless you have mega samples. So, he might do well there. But I think the story is going to be, and we did, sorry, I should finish with saying we did some polling yesterday, which was the 30 most Muslim constituencies in the country. So anywhere with above 20% Muslim population. And we found Labour's vote was down, but it was down 7%. The Independents were on 9%. So it's making a difference at the margins. There might be a few shock results, but I don't expect it to be the story of the election.
There's quite an interesting question about, but I'm not sure any of you would know about whether there is a big systemic problem with unreceived postal votes and whether that's affecting anywhere in particular. But I think that's probably a bit too, it's an interesting question. I think it's probably a bit too niche. Paula, there's a question here from Inda Bugarin, which I think is quite interesting, which is how to explain Labour's big advantage. Does any of this sort of analysis tell us, any of the sort of things you're looking at, tell us what's really driving voter choices here? Or what are we looking at, and does that actually sort of affect anything for what's turning off people?
Story, but it's not really connected to seats to watch. I mean, because we're talking, to answer that question, you're talking about individual voters rather than places, and of course all those places are made up of individual voters, but it's the story of what's happened to individual voters that really tells that. And this is the story that I expect to be writing up after the election, unless the polling industry have been have had the most awful night of their lives. And that is that different groups of voters have been pushed away from the Conservatives by different events. And Labour have benefited most from that up until the point where reform started standing everywhere. The first event was Partygate. Westminster liked to play down, the Westminster bubble likes to play down the importance of Partygate quite often and point to later scandals. But Partygate was the big moment. The breaking of the Partygate story was when I sat in a cafe and when Labour are winning the next election. That was the moment for me. It's one of those, I even remember exactly where I was, which is not like me. I very rarely even know where I am, never mind remember later. So that was the first thing. And that pushed away lots of those first-time Conservative voters that had put their trust in Boris Johnson in 2019 and felt desperately let down by those events. Then we see another wave of kind of, and to begin with, some of those are just pushed into don't knows. They don't immediately swap over to Labour, but eventually they end up in the Labour column. Then we have the kind of rising cost of living throughout the whole period, but then kind of put on steroids by the Truss mini budget. And at that point, the Conservatives lose their reputation for economic competence and they push away a different group of voters, voters who'd stuck with them through all sorts of things, but because they thought they were going to manage the economy well. And then alongside that, we've had this kind of constant rolling crisis of the NHS. Which has run through that whole period as well. And those three things have all been to Labour's benefit predominantly. And then later we've got things around immigration that become to Reform's benefit. But I think those are the three things that have pushed voters towards Labour, because Labour have always been seen as most trusted on the NHS. Labour weren't implicated in the Partygate scandal in the way that the Conservatives were, so they were able to benefit from that. And then they've been able to become as trusted on the economy as the Conservatives are post the mini budget. So those are the things that I think have driven it. And as far as I can see, nothing has really pushed those things out during this campaign. We've had 6 weeks of making not much difference to that story.
And that's really, really interesting. Just wanted to ask a question, then I'm going to come back with some rapido predictions for individual bits, which you can all, whatever, because that's what there's huge amount of demand from our viewers. And thanks for all these questions about which seats are going to go which way. If we have a sort of very different set of geographies in Parliament, representational geographies, so we have Labour with quite a lot of suburban, maybe even more rural MPs. Ed Balls was saying that might make it much harder for Keir Starmer to do his planning reforms. Lib Dems, if they've won, they've said they wouldn't consider doing a coalition with the Conservatives or supporting Conservative government. But do they stay as sort of quite left-wing opposition if basically they've won a lot of seats, like we've been talking about Godalming, Esher and places like that? How will the sort of electoral geography that potentially emerges, we look at some of the sort of more extreme predictions from the MRPs and things like that, if all these seats to watch go sort of interesting ways, what might that mean for how politics plays out in the next Parliament? Luke, any thoughts?
It's a really, I think this is now the big question as we turn to what happens after. On the one hand, you're probably going to get Labour with this very big, potentially over 200 seats, maybe approaching 300 seat majority, which means, on lots of tight votes, they're going to have votes to spare. And the whip's going to say, you can not be here, you can rebel. On the other hand, we know that once people get a taste for rebellion, it becomes harder to keep them online on other things and might actually become more difficult. And the thing that I come back to, and this is using our segments rather than seats, but I think it maps over. In 2019, Boris Johnson won 4 of our 7 British segments that we have, including Loyal Nationals, more red wally, established Liberals, more blue wally, and more traditional Conservatives. And it was hard to keep it together. It was, you found it almost impossible. Labour at the moment are on course to win 6 of the 7 segments. They're a very diverse group with very different interests, and finding that common denominator thread, I think, is going to be difficult. And so my ultimate conclusion, I come back to it, basically depends, are we in 2027 and it's 1.5% growth, in which case, fine, you can spend a bit of money, you can do this, and, broadly people just want competence. Or are we, in a situation where, there isn't any money, you're struggling, and there's very little to offer to different wings. So I think a lot depends on the fundamentals there.
Paula, Sophie, do either of you want to come in on that? Paula?
I'll come on to it only to say that I've got a blog that should be out today that addresses exactly the points that Luke's making, that looks at those. A losing coalition is much less diverse than a winning coalition. Winning coalitions are hard to keep together, and that will be Labour's difficulty going forward. But if the agenda stays on cost of living, NHS and so on, it's easier than if it moves on to new issues. So they could, in some senses, be the architects of their own downfall if they manage to fix everything that people are concerned about.
Okay, now, Sophie, some rapido fire questions for you, and you don't have to say. John Edward, most symbolic Scottish seat to watch out for. What's your prediction on that? What are in your Scottish seats to watch?
I don't know if it's the most symbolic, but I think Glasgow Central, I think it is probably quite a good kind of indicator of a seat that was always very typically safe Labour. The cracks started to show in the early 2010s, and then it went SNP in 2015. I think that's quite a good, if Labour can win that back, I think that's a good kind of indicator of them making inroads in that central belt in Scotland, I think. So that's probably what I'll go for.
Okay, Luke and Paula, chip in if you've got something different to say. David S. What chances of Lib Dem gains in Cheadle, Hazel Grove and Sheffield Hallam? Are they in your list or as possible ones? Because that's not what we've thought of quite as the blue wall before, because it's been predominantly south-east. But
I think I made this mistake actually when I was working with Paula and Rob on putting together the seats to watching. My immediate assumption, just because we've also been kind of tracking where Davy's gone during the campaign for another project as well, kind of led me to think that when we're talking about these blue, not necessarily blue wall seats, but like Lib Dem target seats, that they're all in kind of the south of the country, particularly southwest, when actually there's quite a lot of more affluent seats in the north of England, like Cheadle, like Hazel Grove, where actually the Lib Dems have historically done pretty well. And they might have, lost their way a bit over the last few elections, but it kind of makes sense that they will go back to the Lib Dems this time around again. I think Sheffield Hallam's really interesting because that is super marginal between Labour and the Lib Dems. And it's actually, I think, one of the only contests where they are the two competitors and it's not one or the other against the Conservative Party. And I think actually a lot of the vote there will come down to not even necessarily where voters feel like they want to go, but each party's strategy and kind of how important they think it is to send resources there. So, for example, I live in Tooting, we're not far from the Wimbledon constituency, and I've heard that Labour has kind of stopped sending activists there and are kind of redirecting them elsewhere, just so the Lib Dems can take that seat and they don't end up splitting the vote and the Conservatives keep hold of it. So I'd be interested to see if that is kind of there's that type of tacit agreement up in Sheffield as well.
okay.
But yeah, I think those seats are just as kind of blue wally as the ones down south.
The Northwest can have blue walls, blue wall too. Particularly, you have lots of footballers' wives living there, I think. Do the Greens have any chance to win in Tunbridge? That's not one of their four, is it, that they're targeting? This is from Anonymous.
I don't think so, but unless Luke's seen anything in his MRPs that I haven't caught on to, I wouldn't have thought so.
Okay, last one for you, Sophie. Is Ruislip Pinner and Northwood really going to be the last Conservative seat in Greater London? Are the Conservatives going to be extinct in Greater London?
I wouldn't be surprised if they lose that. I think it's probably one of the less likely Conservative losses in London, maybe. But when you look at the swing that Labour is having and the kind of historical precedent of how big the margin in that seat has been, it's not impossible. I think it gets back to what Paula said earlier and what Paula said to me a few weeks ago, actually, when we were first talking about this, is there's no such thing as a Conservative seat at the minute, just because of the size of the swings that are happening. That, if we're talking about 60-70% majorities being potentially swings to Labour, then a seat in London with a 30-40% majority is, it's definitely not guaranteed to go Conservative.
So Liam has pointed out Glasgow Central's been abolished. I have no idea whether that's right or not, but some seat in central Glasgow. Sophie Sophie and I spent a lot of time last week trying to work out where somewhere in central Edinburgh was where Rishi Sunak was standing, which turned out to be where 3 seats met, none of which were any longer called Edinburgh Central, which was like super annoying. But anyway, okay, last questions. We've got millions of questions here, but this question is from Anand, which is, project forward. We're sitting here, is 2028, is 2029, might depend on how well the incumbent government is doing. What will be the seats to watch at the next election, based on what we're looking at now? Sophie, do you want to have first go? And then I'm going to put Luke and Paula through the mill on that one.
Well, I'll just say as well, I think the seat I was talking about was Glasgow East, not Glasgow Central. So just to correct myself.
Geography, there are no centres in Scotland anymore, as far as we can see.
East and the North so confuse me. I get mixed up. I mean, I think it'll be really interesting to look at seats where not even necessarily the Greens, I think, come second in this election, but where they gain the most votes, where the vote share increases the most. So not even places like Bristol or Brighton where, they might do really well and win a seat, but just generally where their vote share increases, because I think, Labour are going to have a really difficult time, I think, in government with this such a broad coalition, like we were talking about earlier. Keeping everyone happy is going to be incredibly difficult. And I think the Greens are now a really kind of viable channel for discontent on the left. So people who don't think Labour is being progressive enough or aren't, being radical enough in government to then shift their vote over there because they're not tied into, getting the Conservatives out anymore. They'll feel like they have that freedom to go elsewhere. And I think that could pose real issues for Labour, maybe not at this election necessarily, only in 1 or 2 seats like Bristol or Brighton, but at the next election to come. So I'd be really interested in looking at places like that and next time around to see how well the Greens kind of channel their energies in.
Luke, where will you be looking to next time round?
So, for me, it will be a lot of those 2017 Red Wall, pre-Red Wall seats to see what is happening there. They tend to have kind of bigger majorities. So if I'm thinking of somewhere in particular, it'll be, I always get it wrong, Mansfield. It is Mansfield, it's Ben Bradley. One in 2017, quite a big majority now, probably going to, almost certainly, I think, going to go back to Labour at this election. But if the realignment was persisting, or at least is a permanent feature to the degree it went, you would expect that to be one of the seats which flipped back rather more quickly to the Conservative Party or the Conservative Unionist and Reform Party, whatever form it's in at that point. So I think there, and also probably as well, a sign the Conservatives are starting to win back some of those heartland seats, maybe winning back both of the Isle of Wight seats as well would be, I think, a Conservative goal. But I also very much agree with Sophie on the left-wing discontent point.
Paula, last word.
I mean, can you imagine 2 days before the 2019 election, any single one of us sitting here and saying seats to watch would be Castle Point, Hexham, the kinds of seats we're talking about. So I don't think we can make those kinds of predictions because we really don't know what party competition over the next 5 years is going to look like. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how big or small the Conservative Party is going to be and what their relationship with reform will be going forward, because that can change things. We don't know how the Lib Dems are going to position themselves relative to Conservative and Labour. And the Greens obviously are still a big unknown as well. So I just challenge the premise of the question, because I think if we'd made those kinds of predictions 4 years ago, we'd have been saying things like, oh, well, we probably better watch Barnsley or things like that. And they're just, things change so fast now. I think the lesson is the electorate are extremely volatile. And if there are no Conservative safe seats this time, maybe there'll be no Labour safe seats next time. We just don't know.
Okay, well, we're going to finish there. And I'm going to pass back to Anna that Paula thought that was a really stupid question. But anyway, and if Paula's still got a job, she'll be doing loads and loads of great stuff for UK and a Changing Europe on our blog and over election night. So do keep your eyes peeled on, we have so much election content. And if you think that actually in this election we talked a bit too much about polls and not enough about policy, can I highly recommend the UK and a Changing Europe full fact analysis of all the manifestos that we put out about 10 days ago, which is really, really helpful guide, not just to the numbers, but also to the issues underpinning that. So thank you all very much for listening. This will be available, I think, later on our YouTube channel. So do tell all your friends and do have a very good election night viewing. And remember, the big message from today is you just can't go to bed all night. So thank you, Paula.